I think that Rob's decision, does make sense.
So in last week's podcast, we spoke about Nadeem Zahawi's defection to Reform UK. Since then, we've had two more defections. Robert Jenrick, the biggest name so far, and also Andrew Rosendale, who is perhaps less well known, but still a long-standing Conservative MP. We were in fact promised that there would also be some kind of Labour defection, though the announcement for that seems to have been postponed. It's pretty crazy how much, even in a single week, can change. Firstly, I wanted to ask you what your overall view was of the Jenrick defection, but also, can we expect probably more in the next few days? You know, is this this trickle turning into a flood?
Well, Nigel Farage had said that there's a cut-off date, that May the 7th, the day of the local elections, is the point at which the door is firmly closed. I think one should take that with a mild pinch of salt, in that if a truly big beast afterwards said that they wanted to defect, I don't think that Nigel Farage would turn his nose up at that. But it is the case that we're in a window now, because for anyone seeking to defect to Reform on the basis that they think either that Reform could save the country or that Reform could save their careers, or both, the earlier adopters will almost by definition secure a greater degree of welcome from Reform's leadership and its members. And indeed, Robert Jenrick was on Monday night in his constituency in Newark being hailed by the Reform grassroots as, you know, a very welcome new lieutenant in the Reform camp. Both the defections that we've seen so far this week, both Robert Jenrick and Andrew Rossendale, have a distinctive flavour to them. So to discuss Andrew Rossendale first, he used as his justification his anger over what he considered to be relatively weak Conservative opposition to the Chagos deal.
In the Lords, is he talking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was there when the Lords, in fact, I voted for a motion expressing regret at what was happening. I think it is Andrew's contention that the Conservatives should have tried to deploy what is called a fatal motion, which is when the House of Lords actually says that the Commons legislation can't go forward. This is very rare. It's the Lords' equivalent of the nuclear deterrent, and like the deployment of a nuclear missile, it may well invite the inevitable extinction of those launching it. And I think also Andrew's constituency, Romford, which is on the London-Essex borders, is one which is demographically sort of core Reform.
Absolutely shooting, yes.
And again, Andrew's sort of ideological pedigree has been sort of nationalist Thatcherite. So it's not incongruous that Andrew should find himself in Reform.
Yeah.
Now, Rob Jenrick, of course, has been the subject of a lot of speculation and commentary. And again, I should declare my interest, as it were, in that when I was a government minister, Rob was my PPS. When I ran for the leadership, of course, disastrously, in 2019, Rob was an enthusiastic and generous supporter of mine. And I personally like Rob and his wife, Michal. They're good company. And I think that Rob's decision, does make sense. I obviously recognise that it was done in a maladroit way, and that Kemi Badenoch's anticipation of it, her team's detective work, and her expulsion of it were the smack of firm government. But it's also my responsibility to take a couple of steps back. And while I've got respect for Rob and affection for Kemi, and indeed affection for Rob and respect for Kemi, nevertheless, one has to look at it in these terms. I think there's been a lot of commentary from people who are not necessarily false friends to Kemi, but who are offering, I think, slightly wonky advice, saying, well, now you've got rid of Rob.
Yeah, let's have David Gauke back. Yeah,
exactly. You should become...
Give David Gauke his birthright. Yeah.
A one nation, born again sort of champion of my particular type of conservatism that hasn't been in fashion or the flavour of the moment. And I think that would be a mistake for Kemi. But even if I didn't think that, she clearly thinks it would be a mistake,
Yes.
given what she said to her colleagues.
But it's still could be a dangerous perception. And it certainly is one that is being propagated by reform supporters, including some ex-Tories who are now in the reform team. Our colleague Matthew Parris wrote a column in The Times which was basically arguing precisely this. And I bow to no one in my love of Matthew Parris and his writing, but I do think that was a spectacularly unhelpful intervention from him from the perspective of the Tory party, because now this is being presented as if it's actually their policy to go full Heseltine or whatever. But actually the centre desperately wants much lower migration. There's all sorts of positions on which the national centre is very different from where some of these wet type people imagine it to be. You know, and I don't want to slag these people off too much. Like, in many ways are very competent in other ways and had some real achievements. But I just think on this issue, it's, as you say, a false friend.
It is. And also what was considered to be the centre of British politics, whether accurately or not, 10 or 15 years ago, is no longer. You are right that the British public have consistently voted for lower migration. That's one of the reasons they voted Conservative in 2010, voted Leave in 2016, voted for Boris in 2019.
Gave David Cameron a majority.
Precisely.
In 2015.
And that hasn't been delivered. Most spectacularly, it hasn't been delivered, or wasn't delivered, post-2019. But if there were a sort of centrist view, by which one means the sort of reasonable establishment-ish view.
Sensibilism.
Then it would be, don't talk too much about this issue for fear of, stoking division. And besides, all of these people coming from abroad are absolutely vital for our delete as appropriate NHS, economy, future demographic health, etc. We now know that migration has not been the economic boon that the centrist establishment has considered it to be, and that there are other costs beyond the economic which it brings. The debate on that issue, like the debate on other issues, has shifted. And Rob Jenrick, in a way, is an exemplar of that, because earlier in his career, Rob, as a loyal Conservative, was Cameroon-coded or Cameroon-coloured. Now, was he deep in his heart a one-nation Conservative? I'm not sure, actually, given his background as a son of Wolverhampton, as someone who was, essentially brought up in a Thatchery, Powerley background. I think it was because that was the mood of the party at the time that he went along with it. But whatever the truth of it...
And he was also quite new in the party at that time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Exactly, a young man.
Yeah.
But whatever the truth of what he thought then, it is undoubtedly the case that the experience of being in the Home Office as the number 2 to Suella Braverman, as the Minister for Immigration, drove his frustration with the government's inability to deal with it, that is, our borders, and also radicalized him or strengthened his conviction that more required to be done. And now, it may well be that that strengthened conviction, that ideological hardening, is entirely consonant with his ambition then to lead the Conservatives and now to be a key player in a future administration. But there are very, very few politicians who don't have any ambition at all. If you are outlining how you think the country should be better or better protected, and you don't want to wield power or influence yourself, then it's open to you to be a spectator contributor. But if you do, and you are an elected politician, then wanting to implement the policies in which you believe is not a sin.
Yeah. There's kind of two different things going on here. There are some, I think, once Kemi Badenoch had received the kind of intel or the whatever was left on top of the photocopier delete as appropriate, she had no choice but to sack Jenrick. So why not do that straight away and look decisive, etc.? That was obviously the right thing to do. However, I think that should not be conflated with the longer term issue for the Conservative
Yes.
Party, which is that they have lost a strong Commons and media performer, someone who was good at taking the fight to the oppositions, who was good at campaigning on certain issues and kind of breaking through. And to be honest, I thought last week in what Jenrick was saying, the bit at the beginning sounded a bit more confected. Presume that was something that he had to kind of cobble together very quickly, because obviously he was bounced into having the press conference early, and some of it sounded quite insincere. But then when he began talking about dishing some home truths, once he'd finished slagging off Mel Stride and looking quite petty, he started talking about things that he had witnessed around the cabinet table. And that was where it really did start to ring painfully true for the Conservative Party. And it was really a lot of what he said at that point was basically impossible for anyone on the right to argue against.
Well, I think the challenge for Rob and for Reform is the challenge that they also pose to the Conservative Party, which is what you're going to do about it. So I think that you are right that Rob Jenrick's account of the failure of some Conservatives to appreciate the scale and depth of what is required.
But he basically said almost all, apart from me and a couple of other people.
Yeah, well, I think that he was unfair on individuals, and I think that he was also wrong. I don't think he implied, but wrong perhaps to create the impression that Kemi Badenoch herself doesn't realise that there's a job of work to be done for the Conservative Party to get itself into a position where it both properly understands why it lost and properly has a prospectus for how the country can be improved. But my own feeling is that Reform at the moment don't have that prospectus for how things should change. And if one were to look at what Reform and the Conservatives have said so far, both are committed to leaving the ECHR, both are committed to reforming indefinitely to remain to reduce the size of the Boris wave, both have a clear analysis of some of the failures of the administrative state, but neither have yet put forward in detail what their prescription for improving things should be. And I'd argue, of course I'm biased, that there's been both a greater degree of detail from the Conservatives so far, particularly but not exclusively on the economy, and also if it comes to people who are both tough-minded and able to deliver, that if you look at the rising generation of Conservatives, Neil O'Brien, Nick Timothy, Katie Lamb, they have more to them than the Reform team at the moment. Am I being sentimental and biased, do you think, Maddie?
Well, one thing I've noticed in the last few weeks is that Reform had been doing more to explain what their policies were. They were hosting press conferences in which they said, here's what our migration policy is going to be, and we'll take loads of questions from journalists and we will be really explicit. And now they seem to have almost like retrenched to a position which is actually, we can't do anything until we have completely destroyed and demolished and eaten the Conservative Party. That, I wonder if that partly comes from a place of slight insecurity, because the Conservatives, there had been a small, albeit from a very low position, let's not get ahead of ourselves if you're a Conservative listening to this, but there had been a slight bounce after the budget, in particular when Kemi Badenoch's response to Rachel Reeves did actually seem to have made an impact. And I noticed from then on that they then move more into let's bash the Tories. That to me suggests a certain fear that actually there's so much that is going to be mobilised against them, and they feel that this is going to be the most gloves off combat we've seen. Our opponents will do whatever they can to destroy us. They think that, you know, Keir Starmer would like to put them in jail. They may have a point with some of this stuff. I'm sure that the amount of lawfare, that, for example, that might be used against a Reform government would be extreme. But I wonder if that's where this is coming from. But the problem is that now we're back to different factions on the right taking chunks out of each other. And the obvious beneficiary from that will be Keir Starmer.
Yes, I think that is true. And if both the Conservatives and Reform are so consumed with fear and loathing for each other, entirely understandable, it's a competitive system in our politics, that does mean that some of the heat is off Starmer. And you have this race in the run-up to the local elections and beyond to see which of them can secure ascendancy what the pollsters call block dominance, because both know that if one is clearly ahead of the other, that by the time of the general election, that the smaller party is likely not to collapse completely, but to have so many of its supporters say, well, I'd rather vote Tory or I'd rather vote Reform, but I want to get Keir Starmer out, and therefore I have no option but to, vote for whoever is best placed to. Obviously, there's a core of Tories, current Tory voters and supporters, who would never vote Reform and vice versa.
Yes.
But there are a significant number of people who, I'm sure by the time of the next election, will say, by any means necessary, let's get Starmer out. The challenge will be if both parties are within hailing distance of each other by the time of the next election, and it's not entirely clear which of them would be best equipped both to eject Starmer and to form the government, that might allow Starmer, but probably more likely a sort of broad rainbow left alliance, to keep its hands on power.
Yeah, and actually, Reform, if they basically tacitly accept that, well, we want to eat and destroy the Conservative Party, but there are, as you say, there are some seats that are not going to vote Reform. Does that mean that there's basically a clear hand for, say, the Lib Dems to just take even more of the Southwest, for example, and other areas that have historically been kind of Lib Dem Tory marginals, of which there are many? And this partly explains why Ed Davey is asking such softball questions of Keir Starmer, because there are actually very few Labour Lib Dem marginals.
Yes.
So actually they have more to gain from their kind of grubby little unofficial alliance that's happening both in the Commons and the Lords, where the Lib Dems have pivoted to supporting government legislation increasingly.
Undeniably the case.
Yeah.
And again, I think the Lib Dems are in a broad holding pattern at the moment. I mean, they see some seats, some currently Conservative held seats, which they believe that they might win, and some that they fear they might lose to them. But they want to retain broadly a significant block of MPs in order to have what they hope might be a decisive influence on a future left or centre-left government. There has been some grumbling over the course of the last week, which obviously very few people have picked up because so much has been going on, about Ed Davey's leadership, about a lack of ambition or definition within that party. We might return to that, though I'm not sure that we should devote an entire episode of Quite Right to the Lib Dems, because we do have to have some respect for our listeners' sensitivities. I think that they may be in the position of an army that made an astonishing advance at the last election and is now seeking to hold the territory that it won, rather than with one or two daring raids, rather than make another land grab. But it is a difficult question for them overall. I think that the immediate reactions, which you quite rightly pointed out, the immediate shock, not amongst many people, but shock there was, that Rob had defected, and the immediate admiration for the dispatch with which Kemi had dealt with his manoeuvrings, has, I think you are right, given way to a broader reassessment that this makes the challenge overall, for the moment, of developing the most effective, viable and coherent alternative to Starmer more fraught. Not necessarily in the end imperiled, but certainly more fraught. And I think that means that the conversation amongst people who wish small c Conservatives and small r right-wingers well, that conversation will be more intense and more intriguing in the weeks to come.
When I was watching Robert Jenrick at addressing the rally at Newark shortly after his defection, I was just looking in the audience, and I strongly suspect that a lot of people in that audience will have put their faith in Boris Johnson before. They were obviously massively let down. They're willing to put their faith in Reform UK. I don't think we're quite ready for the scale of democratic disenfranchisement and complete disillusion. Sorry, all these alliteration. If Reform proves a failure as well, what happens next, having been let down so thoroughly by not one but two I mean, the refrain has been, the Uniparty, it's all the same. But what if Reform turns out to be the next head of the Uniparty Hydra, And if so many of the people entering the party are that feeling of sort of, not in the case of Jenrick, but maybe Zahawi, you can make a case that there's this sort of faint, like, morally dubious, tired ex-Tories that really does undermine the claim to be a newcomer into the field of politics with something new and fresh to offer.
One of the things that you touched on last week, which I think is true, Reform's critique of the Conservative failure obviously contains many strands. But the most salient examples of that, migration rising, taxes increasing, were consequences of decisions taken post-2019 and post-COVID, when Boris was Prime Minister. Now, I was in the government. I could enter a defence of some of those decisions. I shan't now, because I also would want to not only moderate that defence, but in some cases join the critics. But put that to one side. It is undoubtedly the case that that is true. But as has been oft remarked, and as you pointed out last week, many, though not Rob Jenrick, of the defectors from the Tory to Reform are Borisites. So many of those who are most ardent for Boris and retain the deepest affection for him still are the people who defected to Reform in order to endorse a critique of the man himself, the government he led, and the measures they supported. So there's an element of irrationality, you can argue about that, but there is also an emotional coherence to it, in that the reason I imagine many of them supported Boris is that what they wanted was the disruptor who would not be trammelled by the establishment. Yeah. And that is what they see in Nigel. And I think that in Rob Jenrick's case, he has, having grown up as someone who was at a distance from the establishment, and then having joined it, he's now bent on overturning it. And so there is, again, an emotional logic to where he is now. Will it go well for him? Will it go well for Reform? We will see.